So in the second half of our soils lecture, it's going to be part 3 of our soils lecture, we're talking about soil erosion specifically, and both the greatness that comes from soil erosion and the negatives that come from it. So, what is soil erosion? Soil erosion is the process by which soil particles are removed from their original site and deposited elsewhere. So when we're talking about erosion, we're just talking about the process by which soil is going to go from one place to another. And usually it starts somewhere and then ends up somewhere else. So there's 2 primary causes of erosion, and those are going to be wind and water. That's how we get everything to move. And that's how we got everything to start with the whole process of soil formation anyways, is the idea of wind and water hitting rocks and causing it to break up into smaller and smaller pieces. And so that's still just how soil moves from one place to another and breaks up and becomes different parts. Our 2 primary types of soil erosion are geologic erosion and accelerated erosion. So let's talk about those 2 types. So geologic erosion, that's going to be natural erosion that has occurred since the earth first formed. Now, with the way we're doing these lectures, so if you go to the lecture slides, right here it says Grand Canyon on this slide. I want you to click on that, and I want you to watch a video about how the Grand Canyon was formed through this idea of geologic erosion, of just the idea of wind and water erosion over time. Accelerated erosion, this is going to be more anthropogenic, so more human-caused acceleration issues. So these are faster erosion rates that are caused by humans. So a good example of this is the video that I have down here at the bottom. So if you click that one, it says the one titled Providence Canyon. That'll talk about a place in Georgia that they call the Little Grand Canyon. And the only reason that it's Providence Canyon State Park now, and the only reason it exists now is because of bad farming practices in the early 1900s that basically caused a huge amount of erosion and created this huge canyon in the state of Georgia. So please send me a message if any of those links aren't working for you. So our 2 primary causes of soil erosion, like we said, are wind and water. So here's a good example of wind erosion, where we see that the soil is basically moving. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about that topsoil and that organic matter moving away. And on the bottom here, we see a good example of water erosion, where you see the sediment-filled river. Well, how do we know it's sediment-filled? Well, water is not usually brown-colored. What is brown-colored? Soil. So if we see these brown-colored rivers, we can assume that there's a good amount of sediment moving in the water. So we've got 3 different parts when we're talking about wind or water erosion. Doesn't matter which one. We got 3 different parts, and that's the idea of detachment, movement, and deposition. So detachment, the idea of smaller pieces of soil detaching or releasing from the original soil. The movement, so however that happens, the transportation or translocation from one spot to another, and then the deposition of the particle. So where does that soil particle eventually end up? So detachment, movement, and deposition, or leaving the soil, moving, and then planting somewhere else. So let's start with wind erosion. So wind erosion, usually we find this in primarily arid and semi-arid climates, so places where it's dry. Because if it's dry, that means there's not that much moisture. And if there's not that much moisture, that means things are going to be, the soil particles are going to be a little bit looser and a little bit easier to just pick up and move with the wind. Your damage can be on-site and can also be off-site, because wherever all this soil ends up, it could end up being a good thing. It could end up being a bad thing because you get a whole bunch of soil from somewhere else that's now covering up all the stuff that you had before. So maybe that's not the right type of soil, or maybe you get so much that it just covers up whatever you were growing there and causes just as much of a problem. So with wind erosion, we're going to have three parts to it, or kind of three different ways that soil will move through the wind. So the smallest particles detach and move by suspension. So that when you think of like dust in the air, so when we think about almond harvest season here, that's suspension, when you can kind of see it in the air. Your medium particles are going to detach and move by what they call saltation, where it's going to be almost like they jump and they hop, and they jump and they hop, and they jump and they hop. Whereas creep is going to be where the larger particles of soil move, but they're so heavy they don't really get off the ground. They just kind of roll and slide along the ground. So suspension is in the air. Saltation is kind of up and down and up and down and up and down. And creep, it's just kind of rolling along the ground. It doesn't really get up in the air. And so here is our picture example of that. So our wind direction is moving on the screen from left to right. And so you can see our suspension, our little particles get up in the air. Our saltation, the medium-sized particles are kind of bouncing around. And then our bigger particles are just going to roll along the ground there and do what we call creep. So here's a good example of suspension from the Dust Bowl times. And this big, huge cloud of soil in the air, that's what we mean by suspension. Saltation, the idea of them picking up and then hitting the ground and picking up and hitting the ground. And then creep, the bigger particles just kind of rolling along and piling along like what we see along this fence row here. And that takes us to the idea of the Dust Bowl, because the Dust Bowl was a huge problem that caused economic collapse during the Great Depression during the 1930s. So there's a video located down there at the bottom when you click on the lecture slides. So the Dust Bowl was caused by a mixture of things. The most important thing being that the area that it's in, the Great Plains that it happened in, is very susceptible to wind erosion because there's no trees there, so there's nothing but grass, so it's very easy for you to get high winds in that area. But that's something that they're used to. What they're not used to is the idea that they had severe drought for a period before this. So with the high wind, the severe drought, and then not having efficient farming practices and not knowing enough about the soil and how to keep the soil healthy. That combination of those three things led to hundreds of thousands of people having to leave this area, because what happened is this huge wind event kicked up and basically all of the topsoil of this area eroded away through the wind. All of the topsoil. So everything where things grow was just gone. And it was pushed into the air and gone. And so what happened then is we had this huge exodus. And actually a lot of people in Bakersfield can trace their roots back to having relatives who left this area because of the Dust Bowl and then moved to California, basically to a new area where they could do what they knew how to do, which was farm. So here's just some examples of what that looked like and kind of the devastation from it. So there's another video that you can click on this slide. So, do dust storms still happen in the United States, or do we still have a lot of wind erosion? Absolutely. So it usually occurs in the arid areas worldwide, and you'll get the dust or sand or all the particles lifted up. Haboobs, they can approach 60 miles an hour, and they can last for several hours. This is my wife and I on our drive from Georgia, where I used to live, We stopped off to visit some friends in Lubbock, Texas, and luckily we got to their house right in time to look and see this coming. So look at that suspension in the air. And so we got inside just in time as this haboob hit. And not only was it a haboob, then it was a hailstorm, and then it was a rainstorm. And luckily our friends let us kind of hang out in their house for a few hours as this happened. So if you want a little bit more information about that to really see how crazy some of these dust storms can get, click that link that I provide on this slide. So this graphic right here kind of shows, well, where does wind erosion still happen in the United States? So you can see that Great Plain area, almost basically the same area as we saw for the Dust Bowl and the problems that we had with the Dust Bowl. The other areas that you see, we see South Texas and we see the East Coast. So think about hurricanes and the idea of hurricanes and tornadoes. And so that's the other area where you're going to see wind erosion. And that's something we haven't really talked about. The idea that tornadoes and hurricanes, that also counts as wind erosion. So where else can we see wind erosion? When you look at the western United States, because it's dry and we got desert areas, you don't see as much of that wind erosion. But basically anywhere where you have a prairie or a grassland, you're going to get more wind erosion. So the Palouse Prairie in Washington, that's that area that you see, the red area up there in Washington. And then the Central Valley here in California, where we have grassland, you can get a good amount of wind erosion there. And for a kind of a fun little video about wind erosion, click the link on this slide. So how do we stop wind erosion? Let me back up one slide. There we go. So how do we stop it? We want to maintain surface cover. So if you're growing ag crops there, you want to have either a cover crop from once you do harvest, or you want to have crop residue. So don't take every single thing off of the land. Leave something there. You can increase your stubble height. So in terms of if I'm going to harvest something like corn and I want to take it all the way down to the ground so that when I till it up, it's going to be easier. Maybe instead I leave like 3 or 4 inches when I was only going to leave 1 to 2 inches before. And that way that'll help kind of keep the soil in place. I can irrigate or make sure that I've got water on my crops, because these areas that experience wind erosion are usually, we said, the arid or semi-arid areas. They're dry. So if you have water, that kind of helps stop the problem. Strip crops perpendicular to the prevailing wind. So if our wind is coming in like on our screen from left to right, then we would want to plant either north to south or south to north, so that way only, like a little bit of our crop would get hit by the wind and not the whole crop. We don't want to basically have it where our rows are going with the wind so that the wind can funnel and fire right through all of our crop. If we do it the other way, then it'll only hit part of the crop. And then the other thing we can do is install windbreaks. And so basically using trees or shrubs or something else in order to basically have the wind hit it and dissipate the power of the wind before it gets to our crop. So some examples of that. So you can see in the slide, or in this picture on the top left, the idea of increasing the stubble height or leaving a crop residue. So you can see in the foreground of the picture on the top left, you can see bare dirt, or bare soil, excuse me. You can see behind it, that's the idea of a cover crop, that there's some green growing there. And then in these other areas, the idea of crop residue. So there's something on top of the soil keeping it in place. And then in the rows, you can see the increased stubble height, in that there is they've left it a little bit higher to kind of give it some more structure. In the picture below that, you can see the idea of longer stubble versus short stubble. And then in the pictures on the right, you can see the idea of alternating crops. And in the picture on the top right, you can see the idea of trying to change it in terms of the prevailing wind, because you can see some areas there where the land and everything else is going east to west, but all of these crops are going north to south because they're planting perpendicular to the wind. And then in the bottom right, you can see a great example of the idea of windbreaks and trying to protect the areas where you're growing things. In terms of soil erosion by water, we've got 5 different types. You got splash, sheet, mass slippage, rill, and gully. And really you're just talking about kind of a order of magnitude worse with each of these. With splash, it's just like rainwater hitting and splashing, and so you have a droplet of rain hits and the soil moves because the water hits it and it moves, and that's our kind of typical soil erosion. Then you can have sheet, where surface water moves down a slope or across a field in a wide flow and peels off uniform sheets of soil. So basically you have a lot of water moving together and it kind of takes a layer of the soil off the top. You have mass slippage. So when certain soils are on slopes or saturated, the soil has a potential to slip away in large blocks. So the idea of like a mudslide, that would be mass slippage. And then in terms of rill and gully, I really want you to think about the idea of like creeks and rivers and how those things form. So a rill is just when you have like a micro channel of water. So think about like your sprinkler system at your house or at school, where you see like the water comes out of the sprinkler and there's a lot of areas where it works well, and then all of a sudden you'll see like little channels of water. So that would be how a rill starts. And then a gully is just a worse version of a rill, where that little channel just becomes bigger and deeper and wider to where then eventually you have a gully. And so a gully is also how you get rivers to form. But the difference between a gully and a river is that a river actually has water flowing in it and staying in it, whereas a gully is just a empty channel. So how do we stop these things from happening? We're going to have 5 methods, and we'll go into each of these: contour farming, strip cropping, terracing, gully reclamation, and conservation tillage. 6 of them. Remove marginal cropland from production. So the first one, contour farming. So the idea is that you want to think about the natural contours or the different elevations that your property is at, and just farm your crops along those natural contours so that you don't have these problems with water erosion. Because one of the big things you always want to think about with water erosion as opposed to wind erosion is that gravity plays a huge part in water erosion. Water wants to move uphill to downhill. So because of that, if you have a property with any sort of slope to it, you want to use contour farming, to where you can just kind of go along at the same elevation, and that way the water has a much harder time causing problems. Our second and third method is the idea of strip or intercropping, which you're going to alternate closely spaced crops with row crops. And then the idea of terracing. So the idea that you actually cut a sloped surface into flat surfaces, almost like steps, to basically slow the water down and try and affect that force that gravity puts on it. So in terms of terracing, on the left there, you can see the idea of where you're just trying to cut the land into slopes. Now, obviously, this is only something that needs to be done if you have a lot of topography where you're trying to farm. If you're not trying to farm with a bunch of topography, this sort of stuff isn't all that important to you. On the right-hand side of this picture, you can see the idea of intercropping or the strip cropping, where you're putting the different types of crops next to each other, and that way that'll help slow up the water erosion, because different crops take in different water and they'll root in different ways, and so that will force the water to act differently and not be able to flow in the one big movement, which is really what you're trying to avoid with water erosion, is this idea of like one big movement of water where your soil disappears. Gully reclamation, the idea that you're going to improve land that has been eroded away through a gully and prevent further deterioration. So you can plant vegetation to stabilize the banks, or you can do what you see here, which is the idea of planting or putting in rocks or other sort of material to basically keep that area from eroding away and channel the water more efficiently. And then our last two, so conservation tillage, the idea of no-till farming or these other methods where you're not going to disturb the soil as much, and that way you can increase the organic matter and the water holding capacity while decreasing erosion. So looking at these methods, so you got the no-till method, strip till, and conventional till 1 month after planting. So the idea that you're going to try and keep these areas from losing their capability of producing good plants. And so the idea is that water erosion will come in here and cause problems by just taking the soil away. So if you can use one of these conservation methods where you're increasing your soil organic matter, that means that there's going to be stuff there, and it's going to have more space for to hold water, and it's not going to allow for the water to erode away so easily. And then the last one, and kind of the easiest one to think about, is that if you've got marginal cropland, so if you got areas that just they don't produce well, or they could be used for other purposes, then use them for other purposes. And so the government has through the NRCS this conservation reserve program where they help farmers out by allowing them to take this marginal cropland and turn it into forest land or agroforest land or grassland, to where you don't have to farm these areas where you're not going to get a lot of value from it. And so that way you can set it up for another purpose and let it be another natural resource, let it be a wildlife area, and really that will help prevent water erosion, because the more your land isn't the same, the easier it's going to be to not let the water flow right through it. And that's what I've got for soils. So make sure to also look at the lecture slides on your own, look at all the videos that I attached there, and let me know if you have any questions.